All right, so I got some pretty major updates here for you guys on the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine and the prospects of this spiraling out of control towards a broader global conflict or a direct nuclear confrontation between the United States and Russia. Because yesterday we had a pretty terrifying couple of hours here where, as reported here by Bloomberg, they say that Poland was saying that a Russian-made missile had hit within their territory and ended up killing two people. Okay, so the reason why this is important, obviously, beyond just, those two unfortunate people ending up dying, is that Poland is a member of NATO, right? This military alliance that we have with a bunch of these other countries within Europe, including some that are close to either the Russian border or close to this ongoing invasion that is occurring in Ukraine. And essentially, this is something that we have been worrying about for a long time, where even if it's something that's an accident, if Putin or the Russian military accidentally fires missiles into a NATO country, that could theoretically lead to a triggering of Article 4 and then Article 5, meaning that other NATO countries would have to get involved in the war, and again, it would just spiral out of control from there. So this was the initial reporting that we got on this, and it was pretty wild to see, all of this chaos unfolding on social media and within, different countries as well, who were kind of giving their takes on this and saying what the response should be to this. And it's especially wild given the fact that later we figured out that, and this is what it actually looked like, the destruction on the ground, but later we figured out that it wasn't actually a Russian missile that had hit within Polish territory. It was actually a Ukrainian defense missile that I guess misfired or, went in the wrong direction as it was trying to intercept one of the Russian rockets as, Russia had been doing this massive barrage against Ukrainian territory. So, I guess a little bit of like a sigh of relief in some sense that it wasn't a missile that was intentionally fired by the Russian military into a NATO country's borders, right? That, I guess, is taking the immediate alarm off of the table, right? So I guess good, we kind of sort of avoided a, World War III scenario or a nuclear confrontation scenario for the meantime. But again, I mean, even just the chaos that was surrounding this and the uncertainty in terms of what actually happened was, pretty scary to see unfolding in real time, right? So again, when we got the initial reports, there were a number of different things that could theoretically be plausible. Either it was Russia intentionally firing into Polish territory, which honestly that seems like one of the less likely outcomes or the less likely possibilities, because that would essentially just be Vladimir Putin intentionally extending this war and intentionally spreading it to directly involve other NATO countries or potentially the United States directly. And that would basically just be a suicide mission, not just for him, but for broader civilization as we know it. So I didn't really think that that was accurate when we got those initial reports. And then in the back of my mind, there was another possibility that, like, okay, maybe this was something with Ukraine's, defense systems, and that had potentially gone wrong, and this is what ended up firing into Polish territory. And it turns out that that's exactly what happened. So we got a breakdown here from Jake Johnson in terms of what has been going on over the last day or so. They say, or he says, Polish president, not even going to try to pronounce this name, something Duda, on Wednesday said the missile that killed two people in Poland the previous day was likely fired by Ukrainian defense forces as they attempted to respond to a massive barrage of Russian airstrikes. They got a quote here saying, Ukraine's defense was launching their missiles in various directions, and it is highly probable that one of these missiles unfortunately fell on Polish territory, Duda said, calling the incident an unfortunate accident. He says there is nothing, absolutely nothing, to suggest that it was an international attack or an intentional attack on Poland, he added. So, I mean, again, good that it wasn't Russia basically starting World War III intentionally, but, I mean, this goes completely against a lot of the responses that we have seen from the Zelensky government, from the Ukrainian officials, and even from some initial U.S. reports. So again, the real analysis here, in my opinion, is that, although we may have averted this for the time being, right, having a situation like this unfold is just another reminder that in this type of a chaotic war scenario, this type of shit could just spiral out of control at any moment, right? There could be one miscommunication, there could be one misfiring or something like that, and that could just lead to this spiraling completely out of control. So, I mean, again, as soon as we can get this war to end, as soon as we can try to push for some semblance of diplomacy or, negotiations in terms of how this war would actually end, the better, right? The sooner the better on that, because, personally, I don't know about you guys, but I'm not a big fan of nuclear holocaust or, not particularly inclined to want to go and fight and die in a World War III type scenario. So they continue down here with more details. again saying that the latest findings from NATO and Polish officials contradict the earlier claim by an unnamed U.S. intelligence official that the missile, which landed in a Polish village about 4 miles from the Ukrainian border, so pretty close there to where the actual missile strikes were intended to go, and they said that it was fired by Russia, an assertion that on Tuesday intensified fears of a devastating escalation of the war. They say, speaking to reporters at the G20 summit in Indonesia ahead of the emergency NATO meeting, U.S. President Joe Biden said late Tuesday that it is unlikely that the missile was fired from Russia. So this was pretty much the only response that I saw initially from Joe Biden himself. It seems like he was sort of ahead of the game in terms of knowing that this wasn't something that was intentionally done by Russia or even unintentionally done by Russia. Now, again, that doesn't excuse them in this situation, right? I'm not sitting here trying to say that, oh, this is Ukraine intentionally bombing NATO territory or something like that, right? I mean, they wouldn't have accidentally fired a defense missile into Polish territory if it wasn't for the ongoing barrage of the Russian missiles coming into their territory, right? So, I mean, I don't think that there's really anybody to blame in this situation other than the Russian military, who is continuing in this ongoing invasion, right? But they continue saying that foreign policy analysts and peace advocates have warned for months that the longer Russia's war on Ukraine lasts, the greater the chance that it will spread beyond Ukraine's borders and potentially spark a full-blown conflict between Russia and NATO. They got another quote here from Katrina Vanden Heuvel, editor and publisher of The Nation, who wrote a column for the Washington Post on Tuesday and said, "The stakes are too high for us to sit idly by as the catastrophe spreads and the costs, the risks keep growing." She says, "It might be time to give diplomacy a chance in the Ukraine war," Vanden Heuvel argued, citing recent comments by General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So this is part of this kind of shift that we have seen recently from some members of the military, some members of the Joe Biden administration, some members of, just whatever, the political pundit class and stuff, where it seems like it's becoming a little bit more publicly acceptable to actually be fully in favor of pushing for diplomacy, right? Something that I and many other leftists have been trying to aggressively talk about for the entirety of this war, right? There's only a couple ways that this war can end, either with diplomacy or with, the complete destruction of Ukraine until they are forced into a position where they have to surrender, or, it spirals out of control towards that broader conflict. So diplomacy seems like is the best option out of those three, even if it might come with some, tough concessions that need to be made on both sides. But, again, you have this, sentiment from General Mark Milley, you have this sentiment from Biden that's coming out saying that they are slightly more in favor of kind of nudging us towards diplomacy, whatever that actually means in this type of a context. But then contrast that to the recent story that I covered on my channel just a week or so ago with the Congressional Progressive Caucus putting out that letter where it was completely tepid and banal, and they were basically just saying like, hey, while we continue to support Ukraine and basically we're 100% in line with everything Joe Biden's administration has been doing so far, maybe we could kind of start to think about pushing for diplomacy, right? The most, benign letter you could possibly imagine. And then just a couple days later, they faced a little bit of backlash, and, people were saying that they were somehow in favor of the war or the invasion, or, they're doing Putin's propaganda or something like that, or weakening the Ukrainian defense effort or something like that. And then they retract the letter. I mean, it was just a completely pathetic display from, the so-called Congressional Progressive Caucus, who are now apparently getting outflanked by like General Mark Milley and the Joe Biden administration themselves, which is a point I was trying to make at the time that they put that letter out, which is that, again, they were basically just 100% saying what Joe Biden's administration was pretty much already doing, but just saying like, maybe just go a little bit further, right? I mean, it was just completely ridiculous that they decided to retract that letter and back off from something as simple as trying to push for diplomacy and avoid a potential escalation of the war. But anyways, they continue here saying, in a speech earlier this month, General Mark Milley offered U.S. casualty estimates for the war and said that, quote, when there's an opportunity to negotiate, when peace can be achieved, seize the moment. And they say that Vanden Heuvel emphasized that Milley is hardly a peace activist, yeah, no shit, or a squishy liberal, and suggested his comments signal a potential shift in the Biden administration's approach to the war. So that could be a great thing. They got another quote down here saying that recent reporting has revealed that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan earlier this month started discussions with Ukraine on ending the conflict while nudging Kyiv to show greater openness to diplomacy, Parsi said, who is the head of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which usually does great reporting on this types of stuff. And he says Ukraine must show its willingness to end the war reasonably and peacefully. U.S. officials reportedly relayed to Kyiv, and they say as a direct result of Sullivan's effort, Parsi added, President Volodymyr Zelensky outlined 5 conditions for negotiations last week that no longer include the non-starter non-starter demand that Russian President Vladimir Putin be out of power before talks can take place. Okay, so again, starting to see just a little bit of steps in the right direction in terms of potentially getting to the diplomatic table. And again, that's going to be an extremely difficult process, right? Vladimir Putin doesn't want to just tuck his tail between his legs and walk out of Ukraine with absolutely nothing to show for it. Zelensky, I think rightfully so, obviously also doesn't want to give up any of his territory, especially with all of the destruction that Russia has waged against his country for this long and how many people have fucking died during this war already. Obviously, you understand Zelensky's position, you understand the broader implications of all of this, but at the same time, at the end of the day, some concessions are going to have to be made. That's just the reality of how diplomacy and negotiations end up working. Obviously, again, in my dream scenario, Vladimir Putin would simply just end the war, right? He could do that whenever he wanted to, but again, he's obviously not going to do that, so let's go with the next best option here. But as we're simultaneously getting a lot of these reports behind the scenes that the United States is kind of maybe sort of starting to nudge in the direction of pushing for diplomacy and lessening some of these stark demands that Zelensky has been making for the conditions of even beginning the negotiations. We also just have the bizarre response to this entire situation from the Zelensky government themselves. So I mean, this was one of his initial responses here. They say, here from Christopher Miller, Zelensky said, "Terror is not limited to our national borders. Russian missiles hit Poland." Well, again, we just kind of figured out that they weren't necessarily Russian missiles. They were Ukrainian defense missiles that were trying to intercept Russian missiles and then just ended up firing in the wrong direction and hitting within Polish territory. So I guess he's continuing to say that these were Russian missiles that hit Poland. And he says, to fire missiles at NATO territory, this is a Russian missile attack on collective security. This is a very significant escalation. We must act. Who's we in this situation? I mean, is he calling on NATO to have a direct military response to this based on, again, the sort of false premise that this was a direct or intentional or even unintentional Russian military strike directly on Polish territory? And, he's using this specific language here of collective security, which obviously ties into the Article 5, a treaty and agreement that we have with other NATO countries. But he continued here saying, "I want to say now to all of our Polish brothers and sisters, Ukraine will always support you. Terror will not break free people. Victory is possible when there is no fear. Russia is terrorizing us and everyone it can reach." Okay, so that's what he had to say about this in the immediate aftermath of it. And then we had a sort of doubling down on the notion that this was intentional or unintentional firing of a missile from Russia, right? When, again, we know, according to Poland's own investigation, along with, U.S. counterparts, but he's contradicting this, I guess, still right now. This is just from a couple hours ago at this point. They say that Zelensky, live on state TV, now refutes Western leaders' statements and preliminary evidence that the missile which killed 2 in Poland was Ukrainian. He said, quote, "I have no doubt that it was not our missile or our missile strike. We have to participate in the investigation." They say Zelensky said that he received signals from Western allies that Russian President Vladimir Putin would like to hold negotiations directly with Ukraine. And so, I mean, I guess that's a positive development here, but again, kind of bizarre that, he's saying he wants to be involved in the investigation. He's completely denying that this was his missile or something like that, which I don't really even understand that because, I mean, maybe he could be theoretically right about this, but you're contradicting, the Polish investigation into this, right? I mean, they're the ones who just got bombed and they're saying this wasn't a Russian missile, this was a Ukrainian defense missile. But again, I mean, it's what do you lose from just admitting that, right? Because nobody thinks that Ukraine intentionally did this, right? I mean, I don't think that that's really a plausible explanation here. I mean, the most likely, situation that makes sense to me is just that, yes, Russia was firing a huge barrage of missiles into Ukrainian territory, some of them getting close to the Polish border, and Ukrainian defense missiles went up and one of them misfired or went in the wrong direction, and that's just what ended up happening, right? It's a pretty simple explanation. I just don't really understand what Zelensky's motivation would be to just deny that, because again, nobody's getting mad at him. The Polish authorities are already coming out. They're saying, this was a completely unintentional accident. Nobody's to blame for this other than the ongoing continuation of this war in and of itself, etc. So I just don't understand, what is the motivation for coming out and contradicting that line. But he gives a little bit more information here in terms of what has been going on recently. They say that Zelensky also confirms that CIA Director Bill Burns' Kyiv visit Tuesday during the Russian missile attack, saying yesterday Burns sat in a a bomb shelter, and then we talked to him. We discussed all the important issues for us. We know each other. He is on the side of Ukraine. They say Zelensky told reporters that Ukraine would like Israel air defense systems, and that he had discussed the matter recently with Benjamin Netanyahu, who just recently retook power in the Israeli elections, who promised to consider them. So that's an interesting development there, because Israel has been kind of lacking relative to other Western countries, especially the United States, in terms of giving some of that military support directly to Ukraine. So they say, meanwhile, the U.S. is expressing full confidence in the investigation by Polish authorities, saying that it is clear that the party ultimately responsible for this tragic incident is Russia, which launched a barrage of missiles on Ukraine, specifically intended to target civilian infrastructure. So, I mean, again, he's doubling down here. He's saying it wasn't a Ukrainian defense missile. I just don't really get it, man. What is the fucking point of that? I mean, again, nobody's really getting mad at you. Nobody's saying that we're going to invade Ukraine as a result of this. I don't really understand the motivation behind that. We also had, just as another update on the Ukraine situation, we also had another pretty massive spending package that Biden is floating right now, upwards of like close to $40 billion on top of the already tens and tens of billions of dollars that we have given to them already. So, I mean, again, the lesson here, I guess, at the end of the day is, nuclear war bad, World War III bad. We should try to do everything that we can possibly at our disposal in order to avoid that type of an escalation or that type of a situation. And just the fundamental reality is that the longer this war drags on, the more likely it is that you're going to have some sort of a mishap like this, some sort of a misfiring or a miscommunication. And that is just going to lead to absolutely catastrophic consequences, even worse than the catastrophic consequences that the Ukrainian people have been subjected to as a result of this invasion. So, I mean, there's your update here. I'll keep you guys posted in terms of whether or not we get more updates on, who potentially was responsible for this. Again, I guess you have conflicting stories and narratives that are going on right now. But, I mean, yeah, this is just another reminder that these types of wars are nothing but absolutely destructive and horrific in many ways, and that, we need to push for diplomacy as quickly and aggressively as possible.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying